Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the latest trends in enterprise tech? Look no further than the Breaking Analysis podcast with Dave Vellante. This data-driven program dives into the most important topics facing the enterprise tech industry today. With a data-first approach that leverages ETR's renowned surveys of IT decision-makers and insight from the CUBE community, Breaking Analysis delivers in-depth research on the most important topics facing technologists and IT buyers. Whether you're a business leader, an IT professional, investor, or just an avid follower of the industry, this podcast is a must-listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast wherever you get your podcast and tune in today to stay ahead of the game in enterprise tech.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. And it is Aaron for just a quick introduction and let everyone know this is the second to last show of 2023. Hard to believe the year is behind us and we only have one or two more left. But we have a great show today. We're going to be talking all about OpenAI and all of the drama that kind of happened in the last month or so. And also, what does that mean for the industry in 2024? And we're going to be talking about that right after the break.
And we're back. And Aaron, today we are going to dive into sort of a topic that we probably should have dove into more a month or so ago, but things happened and we got busy. Things happened, and but we're going to dive.
I also feel like we needed to let the dust settle a little bit too, because it was like I did follow some podcasts that were on our topic, and it was like every day was like, oh yeah, here's all the shit that's changed in the last 24 hours. So,
that's right. We're not TMZ. We're not hiding in the bushes chasing people and being paparazzi. We're getting the real stuff. That's right. But in order to dive into that, we need a third party. We need somebody who's both gonna kind of keep us straight, but also probably bring some hot takes to us. So excited to have our good friend Brandon Whichard back on the show. Co-host of Software Defined Talk and also frequent contributor here to the Cloudcast. Brandon, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Ready to talk all things AI, and that's right. I think we have just enough uninformed speculation to make this exciting, so it'd be good.
Yeah.
Hey, Brandon, you're well past Five Timers Club by now, aren't you?
I think so. I think maybe
do we need to get you the robe? I don't know if we need to get you.
I don't know. I get a robe, a jacket, something like that. So we'll see. I have to go count them up after this.
Access to the VIP lounge, all this sort of thing.
Even better.
That's right. Well, listen, today we're going to kind of dissect kind of the crazy thing that happened, I don't know, a month or so ago, the whole kind of week of what is going on at OpenAI, everything from Sam Altman, who is, well, we'll get into it, but him getting fired and then potentially going to Microsoft and then getting hired back and all the kind of drama and everything. It felt a little bit like we finally, in the tech world, have our own version of like Billions or Succession. Like we're finally making it, we're no longer just the Silicon Valley show where it's a total farce. Like we're in the big leagues. It felt like that a little bit. Brandon, I'll let you go first. What's your overall take on kind of what happened with the OpenAI stuff? Or maybe we should do this for anybody who wasn't paying attention. Should we do sort of a quick post-mortem, since that's always one of your favorite things to do? Yep. Yeah, Cliff Notes.
Yeah. We'll make it quick because probably many people, if you're interested in it, you probably heard it. But yeah, so for the U.S., for people outside the U.S., it was the week of Thanksgiving. All this went down. So the real quick story was Friday. Sam Altman was called into a Zoom meeting. The CEO of OpenAI was fired in what seemed to be like a very short web meeting. That then led to, a major power struggle that spent most of the weekend and then even into Monday, seeing all kinds of people get involved, right? It was sort of people all over the place, everywhere from the CEO of Microsoft to the former CEO of Twitch was briefly named the CEO of OpenAI on Sunday. And it all culminated, which was kind of funny about it, is like if you just didn't listen to anything, is that Sam Altman rallied the troops and sort of won enough support that ultimately 2 of the 3 board members that ousted him did resign. He was part of the group that then appointed 2 additional board members and was reinstated as CEO. And, in the midst of all that, a million different things happened. Everything from the person that the swing vote that voted him out immediately reversed themselves less than 24 hours later. And, they were all going to be hired by Microsoft for like a brief moment in time, like 12 hours of time. But in the end, I think it just comes down to a classic power struggle where ultimately Sam Altman was able to marshal the forces forward to like get reinstated. And to this date, as of this recording, there is still not a clear explanation from the board about why they originally ousted him. So, if you will, that as I like to say, that's the end of season 1. Stay tuned for season 2. Where there is going to be a formal investigation by some law firm, which may be good, may be bad. But I think that will kick off season 2 when the law firm, puts something out. And do they find something new and exciting that would explain everything? Or is it just in the end, succession like, Odyssey, where it's just a power struggle and ultimately Sam won?
Yeah. So first off, excellent recap. The TLDR of that, excellent. Aaron, what were your initial thoughts while this thing was going on? Like, my initial thought was just like, how in the world could what appears to be, at least for most people, because they, just figured out ChatGPT, how could what appears to be potentially the next biggest, most popular tech company in the world just completely, I don't even know what the right word is. Just, completely eat themselves. Like, how in the world what were your thoughts while this was going on?
My thoughts were, this is what happens when a company was really originally founded as a nonprofit and had a board that still had kind of a nonprofit mission and kind of kept those goals to heart. And this is what happens when capitalism meets nonprofits. And the resulting board, the ousting of a lot of those people and the new board going forward, I think let's be honest, they're still a nonprofit on paper or whatever you want to call it, a research foundation or arm, but they're a for-profit company going forward.
Yeah, and just to add to that, one of the things I think is fun about this whole story is that, like, it's, as human beings, like, we like to talk about like people and stories, and it's very easy for us to understand like a story like this because it's just fun to listen to. But really, in underlying all of this, I think is the more central question is like, how close are we to autonomous generative intelligence, AGI, right? Because what you have here is this clashing set of values around. Some people believe it's very close and it's going to be a significant threat to all of human society. Some people believe it's very close and it's going to, if you will, augment human society in a way that we really never dreamed of. And then there's the maybe in the middle of like, I'm not sure anything's ever going to come of this. And I think when you kind of like delve into this, that's really what is kind of at stake, or what people are arguing about. And what makes it difficult and why we don't just talk about that is it's really impossible, I think, to know how close we are to AGI. So therefore, people just kind of come up with their own opinions. And there's all these, to your point, Aaron, about different structures of companies that are trying to account for all of these unknowns, but it's really just unknowable. So because that's kind of not fun to talk about, to be like, I don't know how far AGI is, like, instead we kind of like, if you will, kind of revert to kind of the courtroom drama of it all.
Yeah. And it's one of those interesting things. So Aaron and I have done, we used to do sort of like a beginning of the year AI show, and we'd always bring on Sam Charrington, who runs the great, This Week with the AI and ML podcast. And your comments there sort of remind me of something that he always would say that stuck out to me, because we would always sort of ask him like, hey, where is AI? Or what are we in the first inning? That sort of bad analogy. And he said, the biggest problem with this stuff is every time the kind of the black magic or the art moves forward somewhat, they move the goalpost, because it's always like, oh, okay, auto completing emails, that's no longer AI, that's just whatever, or whatever the next sort of thing is. And it does feel like maybe the one application that OpenAI needs to have is basically just the progress bar, right? We all understand the progress bar. We need progress GPT to just tells us, how far along, how close are we till that end thing? Because yeah, you're right. It does feel like that was the crux of it, but yet no one can define what it is. So it's got to be a weird thing within those walls. I still like, to me, the other part that makes no sense, and this is the part where there are huge giant investors in this thing, is how did this thing that potentially has so much interesting technical impact start as a nonprofit? Like how did Kozlov and all these other big VCs, why would they put their money into a nonprofit, right? Like that's not their vibe. Like the nonprofit thing is their own side thing. They do philanthropy, whatever. But like, how did it ever start this way? That's one of those unknowns that I just don't understand.
Well, I think, I'll give you the best explanation I have around it is that, ultimately, I like to say a lot of times, like nobody knows anything. And so if you kind of go back in time, right, it's sort of like this thing gets started by some smart AI people and even with Elon Musk back in the day, and they don't even necessarily know what they have. And I think if you kind of go back to the launch of GPT, which was like just over a year ago, right, is when they launched it internally, they thought like, a few thousand, maybe 10,000 people would sign up for it, right? And it would just be kind of like a novel, if you will, proof of concept, because really they thought this future models and they would be able to do other things. But that launch resulted in a business that is now, last reporting was it has ChatGPT has 100 million users and it makes, something like a 1.3 billion in revenue. So you kind of go back to, product market fit and seeing the kind of things happen, right? And there's kind of like oftentimes people say, use the product, follow the money. And this is like the perfect case of it. Like nothing has ever gotten more users this quickly and probably this kind of revenue ramp. And so this is where I think, all the rules go out the window when this is happening. And I think as this happened and as ChatGPT and OpenAI realized it, they just knew they needed a lot more money to build more models, right? And I think that's where they just started. It's just like coding something or any other project. You're just like, well, we have a nonprofit. What do we do? Okay, within a nonprofit, we start a for-profit company, which is not unheard of. It's not an unheard of structure. And it's just like, but it's just one of these things where it's just like you're doing the simplest logical thing, but then you kind of like get to the point of like, wow, the for-profit thing is like people think this could be the next trillion or multi-trillion-dollar company, and it's sitting within a nonprofit. Now that's unusual, right? I don't think anyone's faced that question. And then you just kind of end up with like just all the craziness, right? Because no one's thought it through, which is so funny. As I like to say, it's like, a large company like doing an expense report that's just slightly unusual can require so much time and effort, right? But then you're just like, when things like this happen, people end up doing all this stuff really, really fast without thinking it through, even though billions of dollars are at stake.
Yeah. And I would also say too, part of the reason like the explosion and the surprise around it all, it was because you had a lot of folks that weren't necessarily thinking about it from a business standpoint. They were thinking about it from a research standpoint. And they just didn't realize what they had. And all of a sudden it just caught fire. And as you'd say, like probably pretty close to perfect product market fit. And they just didn't even know it. They didn't even think about it. They didn't plan for it. I mean, they were just trying to do research.
But let me challenge that a little bit, right? Yeah. Like I get that, right? Like it's they sort of brought together all the smart, but all these smart people for the most part had either been working at Google, like in the Google Brain team, or over at Facebook, right? So none of them had been like immune to the idea of like the stuff I'm working on drives capitalism, right? I mean, most of them weren't just coming out of just like random academia. And then the other part that I kind of like, I get that they're like, oh, I'm working in research, but the other part of that is when all this stuff went down and they were like, well, we might go over to Microsoft, and they all signed the thing and said, we're going with Sam and we want Sam back and whatever. Like none of them seemed to be like, no, it's okay if Sam leaves, right? Which is weird because at least the way he's painted as the capitalist of the group.
Yeah.
And the board is painted as the nonprofit of the group. But yet when it came to being like, oh, by the way, there's a potential $80 billion valuation hanging over this, they were all like, we would like that, right? Like, like this whole idea of like, well, they're all just sort of altruistically in this. Like none of that holds any water to me. Like that's
to add on to your thought there. I think, so why did everybody so strongly support Sam? It's like, so not only is there an $80 billion valuation, there was actually, there still is like a tender. So most of the people at OpenAI were going to, and they still are, they're going to have the opportunity to sell at that upcoming valuation to the large investor, whose name I forget at this moment. But so what, you can kind of see, right? Like, you're kind of sitting there, you're about to go on Thanksgiving break and you're at a company that's doing extremely well, and you're like, yeah, in a few weeks, I'm going to be able to sell some stock and whatever, buy a house, retire, and many things you can do with that. And so you can kind of see like over the weekend where it's like, oh, this is all going to go away, right? Like the entire valuation. So you can see where everyone was like, well, okay, if we need Sam to get this deal done, like we would all be very, very motivated to be like, yeah, let's make sure he's in line to lead us at least through that. So I think for sure there's the capitalist point of view, but then I think to your broader point is I think Aaron, you said it best, is like I just think ultimately even they didn't like, I think they understood that like, yes, we'll need to make money in some ways, but I don't think they really understood what they had at all. And I think if you go back even further, you could go to so far as to say like almost all of these people worked at Google and worked together, which is funny, right? It's like a team of 100 people that all worked there. And they even, if you go back, they even published what turned out to be like the secret sauce, the transformer. I think the paper's like, all you need is attention, right? So, I mean, this paper is like what set it all off, right? So not only, and you know, Google, I think they're, you know, they like to publish, so it's not unheard of, but like, I don't think they had any idea like exactly what they were revealing in that paper, right? Because I think if they went back, they'd be like, well, wait a minute, let's slow down. So I think they knew it was interesting technology, but even Google, they were using it internally. They didn't have enough foresight to be like, well, we got to release something to show it off. Otherwise they would have, right? So it's hard to know, I guess. It's even really smart people just don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. No, I mean, I can buy that. It's just, it is a weird, it just, the whole thing just feels like such the nonprofit piece of it just feels like such a weird dynamic, like how that even sort of seeped in, right? Because it was like, did you take a bunch of VC funding? Yes. Okay. So you're an entity, right? Will you ever succeed? Oh, who knows? There's no guarantee of that, but the nonprofit piece just feels, I don't know. It feels like a weird kind of.
Well, to Aaron's point earlier, I think in the end, like we may all hate it. We all may be like or maybe we like it, maybe hate it, like capitalism, running companies and, kind of understanding it's like, but in the end, it like, if you will, just like showing people's, if you will, what they're trying to do, what their motivations are, and being very clear about it. That is one of the things that's quite nice about it. Right. And I think in the end, maybe that's a feature, maybe that's a bug, but like in this case, it really kind of seems like that would be more important. Like, okay, we're here to make a lot of money. This is what we're trying to do. It's like, okay, at least we all are on the same page there. When you start to cloud it, it does become complicated and in some ways impossible to manage.
Yeah, but let me bring that up too, because I mean, Sam's notorious for he doesn't have any equity.
Yeah, that's my second big like how did that happen question.
All right, so I can only, maybe this is just the only speculation I've kind of heard, right? So it comes down to so Sam Altman, so very wealthy person, right? Comes out of like YC, and so he's had quite a bit of success, and I guess by that means he's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So one of the things I heard was that ultimately, it's less about motivation around money, because I think he sort of has enough money to live the lifestyle he wants. It's more about power and control. So if you believe that this thing is going to be huge and this is going to be controlled through a nonprofit, maybe it'd be worth trillions of dollars. I think it's quite the ego boost to be like, yes, I am in charge of this billion-dollar, trillion-dollar entity, and I sort of control the nonprofit. So you kind of think of it as sort of like a way to, like, if you will, control the money without sort of like having all the money. But if you already have, more than enough money for your life, maybe that's attractive to you. So that's sort of like one thing I've heard. Because, everything else, because I think when you hear Sam interviewed, he comes across as like, I think he's a very polished speaker, pretty relaxed, and he seems like somebody that you would certainly get along with. But when you kind of delve into his history, like, he left YC, kind of through just some kind of unknown reasons that he was sort of, not prioritizing YC and kind of making a lot of side investments, or if you will, front running the investment in the select YC companies. And then there was this other rumors as well that, he was sort of like doing deals on the side to build new companies that would maybe leverage OpenAI. So if you will, sort of like use OpenAI and connections to then invest in other things and make money. So when you kind of get inside of that, there is like, are you just using this to make more money? Are you just using this to become more powerful? It is hard to believe like I'm doing this just out of the goodness of my heart and I just want OpenAI to succeed. That's hard for any of us to swallow, I think.
Yeah. So here's my third kind of big unknown question. So I listened to some of the follow-up interviews that like Satya Nadella had done right after this happened. And it appears, as best we can tell, unless he is just a tremendous actor, and a lot of this stuff was, seven-dimensional chess that we don't understand. Like, he seemed to be very much sort of blindsided by this. That he seemed sort of blindsided by it, but B, like, he did an interview with Kara Swisher, and he did a couple with some other people, and he basically just said, like, yeah, I don't know most of the people at OpenAI. We just know Sam. And so my great question is, like, does he just have like a gigantic fund that he just gets, like, how can Microsoft's a gigantic company? We've dealt with Microsoft just purely as a podcast guest. Like, how in the world did $10 billion go out the door with what seems like almost no due diligence? Like, they didn't seem to grasp the structure of like their corporate governance. They had no protections in place for their 49%. Like, how does that happen? Like, how in the world, or does Satya does he have way more pull than any of us think he does over there?
Well, my take is it's that simple. Like, when you're the CEO of a company like this, and you feel like, maybe you feel like you've been on your heels with Google for a long time. Like, Google search has been, kind of dominating you for a long time. You've done well in cloud, but AWS is kind of, if you will, still viewed as the leader, probably making about twice as much money as you. And you see an opportunity. You're like, hey, I want to reset the table. This is a new, this is, I think, the pitch. He's like, this is a new technology, a new paradigm. And if we want in, we got to move faster than anyone. And we got to do it in a way that, typically we wouldn't do corporate investments. And I think that was sort of, if you will, Microsoft was maybe the most, if you will, willing to say, hey, we want in no matter what the cost is. We'll write the biggest check, and we want to get there the fastest. And I think if he sat down with his board of directors and said, hey, this is our next chance to add another $1 trillion in market cap to this company. And this is a chance for us to pull even, or maybe even exceed our biggest rivals in AWS and GCP. I think the board of directors, I think that it's just like anyone else. It's like, yes, the money is huge, but for Microsoft, it's really not that amount of money. And two, I think it's just a great story. Like, I think he's probably in there telling that story. This is our chance, and people get very excited and they pull the trigger on it. It's much different than like the next release of like whatever compute at Azure, right? It's like, yeah, that probably has like 1,000 different gating things because no one's really, super motivated or super excited to get it out. But this is, I think for him, it's probably like a career defining moment. That's my guess of how it went down.
Yeah, I agree. And I would add this too. To double down on it's the big move to be first in something. And the reason why I say that is because, by all accounts, Google and the DeepMind stuff was probably going to have the lead in all of this. And AWS honestly seems kind of asleep at the wheel, or maybe they've just gotten too big, or maybe they've gotten too cautious. AWS definitely seems behind in all of this. And this was their way to leapfrog both of them. And I do think, by the way, it's been decently successful, but I think we probably all assumed there was a certain amount of checks and balances to all of this. And if nothing else, it showed you exactly how precarious and hairy this thing was. And no one really knew about it until it almost fell over.
Yeah, I've been watching one of these, sort of lawyer drama series on one of the TV shows, and it feels like that thing where you're watching it and you're like, oh, they got it figured out. Oh, they got it figured out. And then some like low level lawyer walks in and goes, oh, I'm sorry, I was reviewing a contract. There's a comma missing. So the whole house of cards just fell apart. Sorry, I missed the comma. Was working late that night. Yeah, it does. It's interesting. All right. So last question, Brandon, I'm going to throw this to you. If you're Sam Altman and you see Michael Lewis, the book writer, walking around, are you getting him to write the book? Are you like, no, go away. I saw what you did to Sam Bankman-Fried. Does a book get written about this, or do we just sort of chalk this up as like, it was a weird Thanksgiving thing?
Oh, I mean, I think it's multiple books are going to be written about this. And, if I see Michael Lewis, I'd probably be like, hey, we're going to listen, you've done some great work, but like your best times are behind you. We got to get a new writer in here. I can't have you in here tarnishing up my efforts. So I think for sure, I think we're, like I said earlier in the podcast, like it's just season 1, chapter 1 or part 1 is really what's going on. But for sure, like the part that has to come out more is like what was really said behind the scenes to oust him in the first place, right? And that, it just has to come out. And then 2, whatever's going to happen, as we kind of go into the next year, I think of like this next year is all about, the year of the AI assistant, right? There's like 1 million of them. Q just got announced, and of course Duo, and then Copilot, right? So there's going to be a ton of, if you will, products rolling out with that. But what's sort of yet to come is like, what is the next new thing that emerges that you can only do with AI? And I think that's where, if you will, the second part of the book will be something like that. We'll be like, well, the first part was like all of this corporate intrigue. The second part will be like, here's how we stumbled upon what AI was really useful for. And if obviously we all knew what that was, we would just go do it. And then of course there will be a million different people come and go as far as interesting actors. And people, they're very famous people. So I think for sure there's going to be a movie, a miniseries, a book, and a million different podcast series as well. So I look forward to listening to it all.
So who gets the TV deal? Do we just assume it's Netflix or does somebody?
I feel like this is like an Apple TV Plus kind of thing. That's kind of my leader in the clubhouse. They're going to do it. Either that or Hulu would be my guess.
Yeah. Well, and we can't forget about Super Bowl ads coming up here in like a month or so now of what might try and sneak its way into that too. So we got that to look forward to. All right. So let's move past OpenAI a little bit. I know both of you guys kind of have been digging into this. You have opinions about this. Like OpenAI was interesting from the perspective, interesting from a lot of things, but interesting from a technical perspective because they seem to sort of be the one who's like, we have the one uber gigantic model. And Brandon, I know you love that approach. It's like, don't give me 20 different models. I don't want, but there seems to be this sort of face-off coming up in the market of like, do we build against the one gigantic model? Do we offer lots of different models? What's the open source community kind of doing? Like, what are you guys, what's your gut feeling after this? Because I think Microsoft was looking really, really smart for a while there because they were like, look, we're basing everything on the OpenAI model, all the co-pilots, all the other stuff. And it seemed like a very smart approach. And now that you've introduced some uncertainty of like, oh, if you don't own the model, is that a vulnerability? What are you guys thinking just in general about these different approaches of like the Uber model, build everything against that? I don't mean Uber, but like the one model or, model per domain, per use case. What's your gut feel at this point?
Yeah, well, I'll go first. I guess the things that I've seen, and there's a good presentation. It's by Benedict Evans. It's called AI and Everything Else. And I'm sure we'll put a link in the show notes. So you can kind of go through and he kind of gives you a nice kind of overview of the current state of, just what's going on. And I think, he kind of has a whole slide on this. Slide 7 in his presentation is sort of just what you're saying. It's like, do we want a few big models or do we want lots of small ones? And I think, really, I kind of go back to like, it's kind of a boring take. Nobody really knows. But I think as we kind of go into this next year, I think what's clear is that a few big models are achieving parity amongst themselves very, very quickly, right? So the Gemini, which was the new release of Google last week, according to the benchmarks, it was maybe like slightly better than the OpenAI model, ChatGPT, and a few things and slightly worse. So I think going forward, everybody seems to have access to very, generally the same algorithm. So it just becomes like, how much compute can you throw at it? So it does feel like we're going to end up with like 3 or 4 really big models that are ultimately at parity. So, it's kind of interesting from us because it's sort of like, well, that's great, but there's not going to be a lot of differentiation. And then all of the cloud providers this year, basically said, we can help you build a model based on your data, which is fine. I mean, which is also interesting. And we'll see how useful that is. I just kind of come back to, as you were alluding to, Brian, is like, I don't know. It feels like you just assigned me like a whole bunch of more work, right? And I'm not sure I have the right data. I'm not sure I know what to do. I'm not sure I can actually figure all that out. So while the cloud providers, anyone in, myself included, sure, will help you build new technology, but it kind of feels like, wow, if that's what we end up with. It's sort of like, wow, that's just like more homework, right? Versus like, oh no, here's just this great model and I can just go use it. So I'm sort of like maybe more hopeful that like, a big model or a couple kind of emerge that we could just use. But there's a ton of research and a ton of people pushing all of us to build our own models. I don't know, Aaron, what do you think?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I have to step back and kind of go, yes, but I think there's some larger problems that need to be solved first. And it doesn't matter if it's a big model or multiple smalls, because first of all, there is the whole concept of, you look at GPT-4, and it's drifting over time. There's been lots of studies done of like, if you give it the same answers, months ago versus today, it may not answer it in the same way. Sometimes it's refusing to answer it. Then there was this one, I just listened to a podcast this weekend of apparently here in December, the model got lazy and it's like answering less questions, and it's almost like, and no one knows why. And it's like, well, is it mimicking human output that there's less output in December and it's going and taking a holiday? No one knows. And then there's like the custom GPTs that you can go and put your own data in, and then some security researcher cracked it, and here's a command that spits out all of its private data, right? And so I think there's some larger issues of, cloud hosted, and I'm picking on OpenAI in this instance, but those are things that just came out here in the last couple of weeks with OpenAI. So, it's, yes, I think a large model would be great, or even more, and we'll probably talk about this, compact or smaller models that are being more efficient. That is certainly coming into being. But there's just some fundamental use cases, and it's like cloud all over again, right? Hey, you got to solve the privacy thing. You got to solve the security thing. And in this case, you have to solve the consistency thing as well before it becomes mainstream for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder if I did these series of sort of look back shows, and I was kind of trying to draw some parallels to stuff. And like, do you guys remember back when, so we had sort of the first internet bubble, and then all of a sudden, all sorts of companies were like, we're going to build an intranet, and they were trying to kind of use the enterprise version of stuff. But people were like, God, I can get the consumer version of whatever that thing is, a wiki or a SharePoint-y kind of thing or whatever. Like, do you think we go through that same problem where it's like, there's this overall corporate fear of like, I don't want to put my data into the model because I don't really have a private version of the model that I can train it with. Therefore, I'm going to try and build these things and they become kind of clunky? Or do you think we, at least from like a business perspective, as opposed to just like consumer chat GPT, the gap between sort of like the enterprise version or the thing you're allowed to use at business is not that far off from what sort of, the main populace just out on the internet, no firewalls, no rules can kind of do?
Well, to answer your question, I think for sure we're going to unfortunately go through that whole intranet phase of everyone trying to build something internally, and it will probably be very clunky in many cases and probably not do much. But that's sort of the process of discovery. And as I think about it, even the way that we're talking about it, and this is one of the things that Benedict Evans' presentation points out, and this kind of happens everywhere, is sort of like a technology emerges, and the first thing you do is to try to apply it to known problems, right? But most of the time, the big value is like something new. And I was trying to come up with some ideas of like, well, maybe we're just thinking about the whole thing wrong. So as everything you guys just said, it's like the big problem is like you put data into it, it's maybe not private data, or it just hallucinates. It just tells you the wrong things. So maybe the way to look at this is sort of like, well, what if you apply it to problems where, if you will, accuracy and your own data don't really matter? So like one example I was thinking of is sort of like today video games, like, a lot of people like Zelda, Breath of the Wild, right? So what do? You go in, you play the same game over and over. It's the same map. And it's, generally the same, maybe a few updates here and there, but like maybe going forward is sort of like, no, it's really like the potential here is like all video games from this point forward will be like AI based. It's like every time you go in, you can just go in and be like, hey, set up a new adventure for Zelda, right? And it just does it, right? And it creates a whole new world. And you kind of just play the game infinitely, much like a lot of people do with Minecraft. They do all this manually, right? They create their own maps and they create new ways of doing things and stuff like that. So, or like obviously art and fiction, right? Where you're just sort of like generating lots of new ideas because you just want more content, right? And so the idea that like maybe, think about our children today, it's like, yeah, they will get a video game. They play the same map a million times. Eventually, they move on, right? They get to something else. But like, what if the idea in the future, 20 years from now, is like, we never buy one video game and just play the same thing over and over. You just play like the world, and it kind of is an infinite amount of worlds because this AI can obviously continuously to do things. So maybe that's a good idea. Maybe it isn't, but maybe it's just sort of like looking ahead and being like, hey, let's not try to apply it to our own data. Let's apply it to like where creativity is more interesting. So that's kind of what I'm interested to see is like, is that where this thing is maybe going to be more useful? And we're constrained by our own knowledge and being like, I wanted to look at my data, but like, looking at your data, it just may not be that useful and not as useful as we think.
Yeah. Yeah. Aaron, you had a question you threw in the show notes about customization. Why don't you kind of expand on what you were thinking there?
Yeah. So I talked to a good number of customers and partners and resellers with my day job, and the number one problem we're seeing right now is great. I can go use one of these models, whether it's open source like a Llama 2 or OpenAI. How do I make it mine? Like, how do I make it personalized for I want it to answer questions specific to my company. Take a chatbot, for instance, right? I want to train it on a knowledge base, or I want to train it on internal best practices. Well, you either have to use a cloud service and then you have to upload all the data and then, have charges for fine tuning that or security concerns. Again, like it reveals your private data and it's out there, or it's trained in the next version of the model. And so this personalization, this customization, this simplification is far and away the number one thing I'm seeing right now. People now see what is possible with a foundational model that isn't specific. How do they make it apply to them? And it is hard today, because now you either have to go out to a cloud model and you have a certain amount of risks, or you use like an open source model and you set it up intranet version, right? As we're talking here, you have to do fine tuning on it. You have to do RAG on it. There's all these complexities to all of that. None of that feels solved for right now.
I think it's going to be maybe, I even go so far as to be like, how easily or how possible is it for the human beings to kind of solve that? Because to your point, like, I think as soon as you start putting your data in one of these new models and you train it, and it's like, one, do you really know what data is actually in there that it remembers? So I think that in itself is a question. And then two, it's like, how do you lock down that model, right? And make sure it's like, okay, well, if I want to train a new version of the model and another group gets it and they're using it, and, if you just think a couple generations of training the same model, and it's just like, have we completely lost sight of like what's actually in there? You know what I mean? It's sort of like, how do I it's just so much harder than being like, okay, I have a document and I'm going to control the access permissions to it. And, I know who accesses and who doesn't. It just feels like once this data is in a model, it almost feels like data leakage is almost inevitable. I don't know how you're going to protect it.
Yeah. And I'll add this real quick to that. So think of it this way too, like do a practical example, a legal, in a law firm. If you have a model, think of it, fine tuning is like, hey, I want to teach it to be a lawyer. And RAG is more, I want it to be able to search through legal documents. I can very much see a scenario in which startups, start to pop up, and you already start to see it somewhat of like OctoAI, OctoML. They're doing optimization of models, but it's more, hey, it responds faster, or it takes less memory in GPUs or something like that. But I can very much see a niche industry popping up of purpose-built models that are specifically fine-tuned and or trained, and pipelines are already set up for specific use cases.
Yeah. The other thing that pops up is or at least in my brain, as you're thinking about this, is like, I feel like right now, everything's the Wild West, so it's tough to keep up with what's going on. But I do feel like right now, if somebody's manager came along and said, "Hey, look, I have a legitimate business problem that we need to go solve," whatever it is, it's whatever, right? I feel like there's no easy way other than, I guess you could say, well, where would I start? But if you said, well, just start throwing it in Chat GPT, because I don't know where else to start. But like, I don't feel like there's any good sort of common starting place to go like, well, which model would I start from if I wanted to start tuning something? And ballpark, what's it going to cost me? Is it going to cost me like $4,000 and like a day's worth of time at throwing stuff? Is it going to cost me $40,000? Is it going to cost me $4 million? Like, I feel like those two things, like the starting point, what should I use? Like, are there some categories of models that are better for other stuff or whatever? And then roughly what's it going to cost us to get to, whatever's considered good or great or whatever. Like, I don't feel like there's any metric or map at this point for that. And I might be completely wrong, but I haven't seen it necessarily.
I definitely think, to your point, like, I think it's very hard to like come up with a roadmap of all of that. But the one thing I think is generally true, and I think this applies, is sort of like, if you're going to do any of this, the first thing you need to ask yourself is like, do you have access to a lot of proprietary, interesting data that you think could be sent into one of these models for training, right? That's where you have to go. And I think that's like, if you have that, if you do have this big data set and it is proprietary, that's probably the point where you're like, it is probably worth going out and hiring the consultants and starting to figure out, okay, here's how much data we have. Here's why we believe it's proprietary. We've looked at Hugging Face. We see like the 800, however many models there are out there. Like, help us figure out which one and help us to build it. But it's all predicated on like you having something. And I think this is where you have to be like super honest with yourself. Like, do you truly have something that's like unique and interesting as far as the data set? Because that's going to be the real value. Right. And then to kind of our earlier discussion is like, can you find a way to like, if you will, prevent the data leakage of it all? But it's probably going to cost you a lot more time and money than you want. So there's going to be some leap of faith, I think, because when someone sits down and it's like, well, you have really interesting data and we're going to need this amount of like GPU compute. And at the end, we're not totally sure what it's going to do because nobody is. It's like, it just takes somebody with like some real, if you will, risk tolerance to actually pull the trigger on something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the great, well, what is good going to cost me and what is great going to cost me, and yeah. All right, let's jump to how much this whole OpenAI thing has sort of downstream ripple effects and so forth. So, the immediate thing we sort of saw was a couple weeks ago or whenever reInvent was, AWS just decided, okay, the approach that we're going to take, and we've talked about the AWS one a little bit, is they're very much we don't necessarily own our own model. I mean, they sort of do, but they don't feel like they own one of the big ones. They're the sort of all choices for everybody. And they pushed very, very hard into, we're the safe place to run your model. Security is important to us. Do we feel like AWS is driving the boat for AI at Amazon? Or I feel like, Adam Selipsky got 3 hours to talk about it, and yet Andy Jassy is sort of, making the big announcements for Amazon. So, like, is it an Amazon-driven thing? Is AWS are they way behind in this thing? Like, what's your initial take on sort of where AWS is given where like Microsoft and OpenAI are?
Well, my take is I think AWS has just traditionally made a lot of money being an infrastructure provider, infrastructure as a service. That's sort of their bread and butter. And I do think, ultimately they were really caught off guard by all of this, even though we've been watching like SageMaker demos for like, feels like a decade. But so ultimately they've sort of just retreated to their most natural position, which is like, well, wait a minute. It sounds like there's lots of stuff you want to do. So let me give you lots of choices. Let me give you lots of choices of compute, and like got a bunch of chips that you can use to do it. We've got a bunch of models, most of them open source, and we've got our own. And then they did the deal with Anthropic. And then and then we've got our own application that's sort of like ChatGPT, which they call Q. So, ultimately I think, but a lot of it all just kind of comes across as like, it's definitely catching up is maybe the most appropriate way to say is like they're definitely not leading this area. I think they look like they clearly got blindsided, and they're just kind of offering it as like, if you will, as part of everything else they're doing versus like leading, right? AWS is always about like, hey, we're customer driven and things like that. And I think this is an example of where like, well, customers weren't asking about the stuff because they didn't really know to ask. And that's why they sort of ceded a bunch of ground here. So it'll be interesting to see what they do and how they can catch up. I don't know. What do you think, Aaron?
Yeah, Brandon, I think your point at the end there of, I think folks just didn't know to ask for this, and that's why they got blindsided. But I would also say, at the end of the day, yeah, I kind of see AWS as a plumber, right? Providing plumbing and providing infrastructure. But when it comes to this use case of AI, I think a lot of folks want to get going quickly, and they want to get going, to Brian's point, cost effectively as well. And so that balance of all of those kind of naturally at this point in time leads us down one of two paths, either on-prem with foundational models or open source models, or the services. Like this is one of those instances where I think that the infrastructure, plumbing, build out all the pipelines, however you want to do it, in our services and string them all together, I just don't think this is AWS's strong point.
Yeah, it's interesting when you guys were talking earlier about the sort of, I was asking like, well, how much is stuff going to cost and how long is it going to take you to get it done? It was, it very much felt like we're in the age where it's like you said, like I don't want to be a builder. I just want to be a consumer. I want to be a user. I want to be a solver of problems. And I think about all the things that sort of, propped up AWS in the first place that made it, differentiated. It was like, we're here for builders. Okay, we're going around central IT who kind of build stuff for me. Like I'm builders. they claim to be sort of the lowest cost thing. And for a while they sort of were, because people didn't understand cloud economics. But more and more we're seeing everybody's having to go back and optimize their AWS bill. And they were, like you said, their infrastructure, and this is a very application-centric game. And people were always like, well, they don't really have an application portfolio. At some point, that's going to come back and bite them. I feel like they're three things, builder-centric. Is it the most cost-effective? Not necessarily. Do I have a suite of applications that I can just use? Like those aren't necessarily AWS strengths right now. And are they the biggest cloud? Yeah. Are they going away anytime soon? No. But it doesn't feel like the new dimensions of AI necessarily play to their strengths right now. And it's not completely clear that like Adam is the guy to be driving that, because he feels like the guy who's like, yeah, keep the boat rolling along. Don't screw up the money train. Like it's the profit thing. But it does very much feel like Andy Jassy's like, man, I need to get back over there. I need to run that thing myself again.
I would love, it would be so interesting just have a beer with Andy Jassy. Just I'd love to get his like off the record takes of like what he thinks is going on. It'd be fantastic.
Yeah. So on flip side, what's your take on sort of where Google is? Because Google's kind of the other interesting player in this. I mean, obviously there's going to be tons of players in this, but from a big cloud perspective, they almost kind of feel like they're coming at it from the other side, which is like, we've been using AI for longest time. We've had Google Brain and we've had DeepMind and we've had all these things internally. We've been using this and we invented a lot of it. But again, doesn't this feels a little bit like Google kind of maybe like with Kubernetes? Oh, we invented this stuff, but we're not making the most money. Like who's running AI at Google? And in the Google case, like, are they in a situation sort of like the way VMware was when Kubernetes came along, where it was like, oh, we do search. Like AI is just a feature of whatever. We do search. Is the search thing getting in the way of what's potential for them with AI, because it feels like it's so disruptive to search?
I think so. I mean, I think to just answer your question directly, I think ultimately Google is either invested or invented a lot of this technology. But I think because of their business and they're so wedded, I mean, I think the profit margins of search, like search is maybe the most profitable business ever invented, maybe only behind like, Visa or something, something like that, is that's really constrains them. And I think too, they know, and they kind of see day to day, they are under so much scrutiny around all of these things, just regulations, monopoly, and things like that. And there's a lot for them to lose. I think, for example, there's not that much to lose with Bing. I don't think Microsoft is that worried. Whereas everything that Google does is so kind of analyzed. And also too, I just think it's sort of like, if everyone's focused in on keeping the search engine money going, it just opens you up to kind of this whole other flank, right? Which is funny, right? Because we go back in time, it's like, well, that was the thing with Google, right? All these people or a lot of the people that worked at Google tried to sell Google to Yahoo, right? And Yahoo was like, we don't want that. That's not the future, right? And so I think it is. I think this is one of those things. It's kind of like, if you want to call it innovator's dilemma or just a big strategy question, it's like, how do you navigate it? And so far, we'd say they have not done well, because they had all the technology. They sat on it for a long time. Then they felt the pressure a couple times this year. They rushed out announcements that didn't seem well thought out, that had a lot of errors in them. Nothing catastrophic, all stuff that will eventually be fixed, right? And now, they have rolled out Gemini, but it's like, it's so kind of, if you will, constrained around like, we're going to be really slow, we're going to be really deliberate, that I don't know. It kind of feels like to me that they're not sure what they should do, but they know they should do something, but they're sort of just in some level of paralysis.
I'll take it one step further, Brandon. I will say, between Kubernetes and the transformer models, Google has single-handedly been handed and developed two of the most transformational things we've seen in recent times, and they dropped the ball both times. Like
that's a pretty good summary. I mean,
they had both of these things that literally are changing our industry. The origins are them, and they just can't productize or monetize those. And to Brian's point, probably because they can't get out of their own way.
Well, I guess I'll to play the other side of it a little bit. I mean, we've always said like the Kubernetes thing was always going to be weird for them, because it was sort of their first foray into open source, but B, kind of in, hey, we're not defining everything, right? Like, I mean, it's in the GCP side of thing, which is its own sort of interesting thing of, it's Google, but it's not kind of exactly Google, right? It's not like they have to go talk to people. And this one feels a little bit the same way in that, do they have a portfolio of applications that we all know and love? Yeah. I mean, Maps and Gmail and all the sort, and YouTube and all that sort of stuff. But like none of them involve the user necessarily like dictating the experience. They just sort of consume the experience. And so this is where I sort of, again, wonder, does this give Microsoft a heads up, kind of a leg up, because they've done A, they've interacted with companies, and B, they've sort of co-created with their communities and so forth. And I don't know that Google can necessarily say that. They're great at building services and extending an API to, I almost wonder if, their route to success with this stuff is to just go like, stop thinking about training models and stuff and just give people a Maps experience, give them a whatever experience. Does that have to be in the GCP domain? No, not necessarily. But yeah, they feel like they're the one where you're like, yeah, they're kind of a platypus. Like they're, are they amphibious? Are they on land? Are they in water? I don't really know. But, like you said, they know the technology so well. And they do have the weird problem. It does feel like people are leaving there, or they just don't have I don't know. They feel like they're getting in their own way. Okay, we've been going for a while. One last question, and we've talked about this somewhat. I'm wondering if 3 or 4 years from now, we don't talk about sort of the big three anymore. We sort of talk about like, well, there's 3 infrastructure clouds, or there's 3, those 3, and then we're talking about like the 3 AI clouds. Like I feel like there's an opportunity for some things to emerge if they can figure out the experience right. And maybe it's DGX cloud, maybe it's not. Do you guys? Obviously the downside to this is it's insanely expensive to build a cloud, as we've talked about for years and years. It's, multiple tens of billions of dollars every quarter and so forth. But do you feel like there's enough, ways you could differentiate AI that there could become a 4th, a 5th, a 6th sort of type of cloud that we talk about? They don't maybe necessarily have to be as big, but they're the place that people go to for this stuff? Or we're sort of at the mercy of whatever the 3 big cloud providers plus on-prem or open source can build?
Yeah, well, my take would just basically be that there's going to be space for the ultimate AI application, right? Because I think whatever the new thing is that sort of can get a bunch of users, that has some type of level of differentiation or a moat around it, is out there. And that's probably going to come out of left field, right?
Yeah.
And then I think as far as building the models and things like that, all the big players, and I think I've said this before in another podcast, it's like, is this a generation that kind of leaders that all read Innovator's Dilemma? They all see this as a huge opportunity. No one's going to give it away. Everyone's going to go spend as much money as it possibly takes to have GPUs and drive down the cost of that and to build models and make sure that they have it. And it'll be a very fiercely competitive thing, which will hopefully be good for consumers. But I don't think, there isn't going to be an infrastructure. I'd be shocked if a new infrastructure provider kind of spun out of it, with maybe the exception of NVIDIA, who's sort of the ultimate arms dealer, right? They have the only technology, so they can build out the DGX cloud such that it can continue to differentiate itself. Maybe that's the only one that could spin out of it. But other than that, though, I think these companies are invested to win it, and they'll do whatever it takes, right? Tens of billions of dollars is not a big deal if they think this is the next $1 trillion opportunity.
Yeah. So interesting. I was just thinking this through for a second. I could see a scenario in which OpenAI becomes a big quote unquote cloud, because meaning like, hey, they take their cloud services and custom GPTs and they have a GPT store and all things they're planning to do already. And they've already hinted at, I could see them becoming a very big player. I could see on the opposite end of the spectrum, NVIDIA with DGX Cloud for the builders that are out there, and almost this like new architecture, and it's super GPU heavy, and it's something they've been working on for a long time. Now, I don't think that's going to be mainstream, because I think that's going to be super niche-y, super big, super bespoke, none of the clouds meet their needs. They have to go to DGX Cloud. But I could see it being another alternative. Now, what I was thinking about when I hesitated, though, was like, which one of the big three potentially starts to lose in this, right? Like with every generation of the next big vendors, which one falls by the wayside? I don't know, because I can make a case for all of them, because even though Microsoft seems so far ahead, they're so far ahead because they've partnered with OpenAI. They don't have stuff on their own. Google seems to be getting in their own way, and AWS seems to be falling behind. And so I could build a case for any of those three.
Yeah. No, I could see that. And I think what's the other part of that's going to be interesting is, if this AI thing is as big or as impactful as people are sort of predicting it to be, and who knows, it may not, but it feels like it's going in that direction. Is like, are the same people who are leading it today, the Adam Selipskys or Andy Jassy's or Satya or whatever? Because do they stay in place, or are they? And I hate to use this term, but it's frequently termed. Are they sort of peacetime leaders, or are they more wartime leaders? And we heard rumors of like, hey, if Sam Altman goes over to Microsoft, like this would be the right time for Satya to potentially step down. He's made this huge transition to get them to be a cloud company, to somebody who's sort of AI centric take over these things. So I think we're potentially at a crossroads of even just the people that are leading the companies. Like Sundar Pichai, who runs Google, is very much a guy who came up in the search world, right? Like, does he have too much history with search to be the right person to lead them if the world becomes an AI centric world? So I think those are going to be sort of interesting as well. Well, let me do this. We've been talking for a long time. I'll give you guys all the floor, 2 minutes ish. One last thing that you think is going to be sort of an interesting byproduct that sort of comes out of all of these, sort of this new era of AI that we're potentially walking into.
Well, I'll just give two things. I think, we talked a lot about the future, but the things that the reason people should be excited. And I do think writing code and, if you will, just editing English, or probably all languages, is forever changed. Like, I think anyone that is like, even if you have a novice understanding of writing code, you kind of like, once you've used ChatGPT and help you kind of navigate some few personal projects, or just have it maybe edit something that you wrote, like, hey, rewrite this, make it a little bit more formal, or make it more informal, or make it, in a different voice. You kind of see the power of it. So, what will happen in the future is always hard to know. What's here to stay is, I think those things are fundamentally changed forever. And I think that's great. Like, no one wants to sit down and crank out a lot of boilerplate code, and just the rapid ability to learn from it. And when you're doing things like that has just, for me personally, has been fantastic. So I look forward to more of that in the future.
Agreed, by the way, Brandon, with you completely on the changing of it. But I'll actually bring a technology one back that we actually didn't talk about much on this one, because it's not OpenAI related. But there's the whole idea coming of compact models or small models. Mistral 7B or Microsoft, maybe they're hedging their bets and they release something called Phi 2, if I remember correctly. But instead of models being trained on trillions of parameters, Mistral 7B is 7 billion parameters and Phi 2 is 2.7 billion parameters, and starting to perform just as well. So this idea of optimization, and now we kind of figure out, I don't know that anyone completely understands it, but we're starting to figure out more and more what it takes. So now you can become more efficient over time. And because it's more efficient, it's smaller and more compact. So I think that is going to be a super interesting area going forward.
Yeah, I think, Aaron, we didn't coordinate on this. You sort of stole mine. I feel like the one, well, no, it's fine. I feel like the one thing that, this last year showed us the possibility of what's out there, the possibility of, what a new user interface looks like, how easy it can be to create stuff and iterate on stuff. I do feel like the fact that, we have this huge bottleneck of, I can only do this if I have the most NVIDIA chips. And, there seems to be sort of one chip supplier that's dominating stuff. I do feel like the next big breakthrough is going to be the thing that says, I can do this on lesser capable chips, smaller data sets, things that are more portable, essentially the economics of this take a leap forward. And I'll be really interested to see who's kind of focused on that, right? Because we've had an era now of people that have the most money with the biggest data sets, with the biggest data centers. But that doesn't feel terribly terribly sustainable for, the next generation where this gets out into the masses. So be very, very interested in that stuff. So anyways, guys, I'm going to wrap it up with that. We have been going for now 58 minutes, and just to put that in perspective, like that's what, a third of a Joe Rogan show, or half of some of these other ones. So I don't know how those guys do that. We enjoy doing the long ones end of the year, but congratulations for getting it through it. I'm going to let you guys go and hydrate and kind of rest up from doing this. Thank you all for being on. Brandon, as always, any plugs or things that you want to get out there for the people, for the masses?
Yeah, just join us. If you like more podcasts, go visit us at softwaredefinedtalk.com and subscribe to the podcast, or subscribe right in this podcast player to listen to. And of course, join us in the Slack, and you can talk to Brian and Aaron, who are there as well. So thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, listen, one last piece of housekeeping for everybody. This show will go out this week. We will do a last Sunday show. Aaron and I are going to do the year-end show, the year-end sort of wrap-up show, the prediction show. That's going to go out on Sunday. And then we're going to take a well-deserved rest. Aaron's going on vacation. So we will have sort of a show right around 24th-ish, I think, which is like Sunday, right around Christmas time. We'll take a week off, and then we'll be back in January. So we'll give you guys some time to not have to listen to podcasts. So Aaron and Brandon, thank you so much for the time. Lots of interesting AI stuff. I'm sure this is going to continue into 2024. So folks, thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for listening every week, giving us reviews and rankings and other things like that. And with that, we'll wrap it up, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.